Welcome to Direction in the Deluge on World Water Day. My name is Hayley Jarrett and I'm the CEO of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I'll be facilitating the meeting today. We have an excellent moderator coming up as well. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I'm joining you from Gadigal land in Sydney, and as you introduce yourself in the chat, it'd be great if you could let us know where you're joining us from as well. A few housekeeping things to kick us off. This event is being recorded. The video of this recording will be available on the Supply Chain Sustainability School website after the recording, so you can share it around and watch it again later if you like. While we're having the event on, if you could please keep your microphone on mute so that everybody can have a great listening experience. And if you're not presenting, please keep your video off. Like I've said previously, if you can jump into the participants list and amend your name to your full name, we will be taking the attendance and you'll get credits towards your school's participation record at the school. So if your organisation is going for gold and trying to escalate up those membership levels with us, attending at this event will count towards those activities. So please let us know who you are so we can give you that credit. Like I said, please introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any questions throughout the event for the speakers or of me, feel free to send me a direct request if you're having tech issues. If you have a question for the panelists, please let everybody know your question. I'll be collating them all for the Q&A session at the end using the chat function today, please. So to give you a bit of context to kick things off, so today is World Water Day, and this event is about what water means to people, its true value, and how we can better protect this vital resource. I know that there's a lot of attention rightfully on carbon dioxide emissions at the moment and those greenhouse gas warming potentials, but I think it's also important that, especially on such like a day like today, that we look at the full spectrum of environmental factors, and water is definitely in there. So if we sort of give you a bit of a 3-second snapshot on water overviews, you know, if you've been living in a bubble and you don't know what the SDGs are, then please have a look at the number 6, which is clean water and sanitation. So that's looking to say, you know, in terms of by 2050, it's projected that at least 1 in 4 people will suffer recurring water shortages. Safe and affordable drinking water for all are looking to get for all by 2030 requires that we invest in adequate infrastructure, provide sanitation facilities and encourage hygiene. And goal number 14 also is around to be able to conserve and sustainably use oceans, seas and marine resources for sustainable development, including ocean acidification. This increases adverse impacts of climate change, including ocean acidification. Overfishing, marine pollution are jeopardizing recent gains in protecting portions of the world's oceans. So that gives you a bit of a global context in the SDGs around looking at this issue as well. More of a domestic front, the National Water Productivity Commission has put out a draft report on the national water reform. It was released on the 11th of February and is looking for feedback at the moment. I think you've got until Wednesday this week to get your feedback in. But the draft report is assessing the progress of the Australian state and territory governments towards achieving the objectives and outcomes of the National Water Initiative and provides practical advice on future directions for national water reform. So if you haven't had a look at that draft report, you're looking to get a submission in, you better get onto that pretty quickly. But it means that a lot of people in Australia at the moment are obviously focusing on water reform within Australia. And much more recently, for those that haven't watched the news over the past few days, Australia's got a little bit of rain coming through it. So if you're anywhere near the east coast of Australia at the moment, all of those dots down the right-hand side, and of course the top end's had some water as well, but all those red dots you can see that's received more than 100 mils in the last 24 hours. So whilst when we created this event and we called it Direction in the Deluge, we didn't expect there to be an actual deluge occurring at the time of running this event, but it certainly brings things into context around water management and the flow-on effects of that. So 12 months ago, we're going through drought. Now we're looking at flood watch as things come in. And as of this morning, the New South Wales State Emergency Service have 103 notification warnings out for everybody, and 33 of those are evacuation warnings because of the flood and potential flood zones through all of our water and river systems. So I suppose that just puts things in a sort of a bit of a context from a global, national and very local perspective for a lot of people on how important water is to our environment and how important it is for just maintaining our standard of living. And today we've brought you some speakers to talk through water, water issues, water innovations, and what it means and how we get there. And a couple of those have obviously come from the third-party specifications and rating schemes. Of course, we also acknowledge that we're in industry partners, industry fellows with a few of organisations that run those third-party schemes who push the industry beyond compliance and those rating schemes to get up and beyond there. So we'll hear from a couple of those later. I don't want to take any of their thunder away from them. For those keeping track, I am not intentionally giving water puns today, but I apologise for any bad ones that come through. So our program is pretty simple. We're going to have a couple of interviews with a few people and then Q&A at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Richard Evans, who's the Managing Director at Talent Nation. So Talent Nation is a full service, purpose-driven executive search and recruitment company providing corporate and technical staff in core areas of expertise. They specialise in environmental recruitment, sustainability recruitment, and not-for-profit and social enterprise recruitment. Richard's commitment to clients and passions for industries he specialises in has earned him the reputation as a leading environmental and sustainability recruiter in Australia. As a non-executive director with the Banksia Environmental Foundation, Richard is an active supporter of many sustainability initiatives. He jointly established a sustainability forum for many of the country's leading sustainability thinkers to meet and discuss ways to improve and expand their business, help and support their communities, and learn from their environmental knowledge and experience. He has an armful of qualifications too, but I think the thing most relevant to World Water Day is that he's addicted to kite surfing. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard to moderate our interview and Q&A panel today. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Hayley. Look, it's great to join everyone virtually. At the moment, I was actually saying to Hayley before, it was bizarre being at a conference last week and actually being around people. So it was quite a surreal experience. And I'm very impressed that you rolled out ocean acidification, Hayley, in the opening statement. But hard to believe that, as you were saying, that people are experiencing water shortages, given what we are seeing in New South Wales at the moment, and certainly our hearts go out to those that are impacted by the deluge at this point in time. Look, very, very grateful to have a fantastic panel joining us today, and I'll introduce them each one at a time. You can see from the screen there that Hayley's popped up who we've got speaking, but first I'm gonna introduce Hugh Pohlner, who's a principal at Aither. Aither is Australia's leading team of advisors specialising in water policy, water markets, infrastructure and natural hazards. Hugh is a General Sir John Monash Scholar and Oxford graduate with an international profile in the water governance sector and China studies community. His experiences living and working on several continents have equipped him to work flexibly and adaptively. Hugh is driven by his commitment to making a practical contribution to improved management of natural resources globally. So Hugh, first I'd love you to just maybe provide a little more colour around the role that you undertake for Aither, and then if we can then roll into what you see as the most significant opportunity for water sector innovation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm based in Melbourne, the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and as Richard says, I work for a small consulting firm called Aither. We are predominantly based in Australia, but have a few staff overseas as well in the UK and the US. And so what we do is effectively consult to a range of different organisations to enable them to make better decisions about water. And so that includes governments at the foreign governments, federal governments here in Australia, and state and local governments, but also corporates, water market participants here in the Murray-Darling Basin water market, and a range of other not-for-profits and other entities. And so just as an example, Hayley was speaking about the Productivity Commission process in her introductory remarks. And one of the pieces of work that we're currently doing is working with the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment here in Australia, working with them to work with all of the state and territory governments around renewing the National Water Initiative, which Hayley mentioned. So we're working across all the governments to try and shape up what the next iteration of that national policy platform will look like here in Australia. So a lot of work at the public policy end of the water debate, and then also a real focus on economics and strategy. So we're largely not scientists or engineers, a lot of economists and public policy professionals in our firm. So my role is to lead our international business development, and we work on a number of different continents around the world, with a particular focus on water scarce regions. And I also lead our water policy and management sector, and so lead a lot of that work that we do with governments here in Australia around policy reform processes. So in terms of your question, Richard, you want me to just jump into that now?
That would be great. Fantastic. Right. Thanks, you.
So yeah, the question is around what's the most significant opportunity for water sector innovation. And at the risk of being accused of going too meta too early in this conversation, my genuine response is that I think the most significant opportunity for water sector innovation is to create and sustain the conditions that promote innovation in the water sector at scale, be that by individual or corporate users of water, by water and wastewater utilities, or by providers selling services into those markets. So in my experience working with ministers and senior government bureaucrats here in Australia and internationally, and with senior executives in large corporates across several continents, my view is that the reason we haven't already achieved the water-related SDGs, which Hayley spoke of, is not that there's a lack of understanding about why we should pursue better outcomes from water management. I think few people dispute that more efficient, more equitable, more sustainable management of scarce water resources is a good thing, and we should try to achieve that. So the question of why is basically undisputed. The what, in terms of some of the tools that we have, tools and technologies, again, finding the right tool or the right tech for the right circumstance is obviously a challenge, and something that we're continually improving across different parts of the sector, and many of you, I'm sure, are focused on that from a supply chain point of view. And technical innovation will continue, and of course, new, cheaper, fit-for-purpose tech will no doubt change millions of people's lives over coming years when it comes to water management and use. But there are many countries in the world, including Australia and New Zealand, where virtually the entire population, not quite, but virtually the entire population has access to clean water, improved sanitation facilities on demand, and where farmers and businesses have access to water more or less when and where they want it to produce. And so the environmental sustainability of those processes is a bit more complex, but we do have the tools in a lot of instances that we require to do better at water management. And so what we find is often missing is the how of good water management. So we hear that the politics are too hard, the funds are too limited, the local community will resist change, legislation or regulations don't allow it. And so the reform or innovation, whether it be a government or a business that is considering it, gets stalled or slowed. And so, yeah, I'd like to just focus briefly on this question of creating that environment where innovation can flourish. And coming back to World Water Day, in closing, our view is that one of the most powerful ways to break down these barriers that block reform and innovation is to properly value the resource. And so, not coincidentally, valuing water is the theme of this year's World Water Day. And so if we don't value water, by which I mean if we don't understand and weigh up the many benefits that we get from water, economic, social, cultural, environmental, recreational, we won't innovate because there isn't the incentive to do so. There isn't the benefit case for innovation. And so on the flip side, I guess I just leave people with this idea that if we do value water, by which I mean if we seek to understand how much it means to us and to future generations, if we create incentives for people to be more efficient in its use, things like water markets in agriculture, if we recoup the costs of water infrastructure such that we have the financial means to build the resilient infrastructure of tomorrow, and if we do all that so that investment is attracted into the sector, then we foster the certainty and the return on effort that breeds innovation, because innovation will be rewarded. So there's a bunch of specific ideas within that I can explore, but I think in general, yeah, the scope for really creating and sustaining those conditions that breed innovation, we need to do a lot better on that in the water sector, I think.
Excellent. Thanks, Hugh. Are you seeing anywhere globally where this is, they say necessity is the mother of invention, and obviously we don't have the same stresses and challenges that other regions has, but is there anywhere that you look to, you know what, we should be looking to them because they do value water, or they've got the policies in place, or they've got bipartisan support for various initiatives, whatever that means. So yeah.
Yeah, so look, I think I wouldn't downplay the level of achievement in Australia and New Zealand. I know that our water management, particularly here in Australia and particularly federally, has come in for a pretty solid bashing in the past couple of years in terms of the policy direction and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and these sorts of things. But we actually have a world-leading water policy and management regime here in Australia. We certainly, in terms of innovations like water markets and water trading, we are world-leading in terms of allowing individuals to make decisions on the basis of how they value water financially within a water market. So things like that actually are really prominent and widely reflected upon internationally by people that we speak to as being really sort of prominent innovations in water policy and governance. Outside Australia and New Zealand, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head by saying necessity is the mother of invention. I think where we have communities that are really hard up against hard immovable constraints around water availability, water scarcity, we're seeing pretty rapid innovation. So the Middle East, I think a lot of sort of very technologically driven, perhaps more so than policy or governance, but technologically driven, infrastructure-based innovation around sustainable desalination, around groundwater management, a range of innovations in that space. And I think to some extent the capacity to put significant public funds towards demonstration projects, concept projects that really, I think, are focused on looking, decades down the track and saying, we have serious constraints on water availability that aren't going away and will probably get worse. How do we sustain a growing population in that environment? And we see those decisions being made, or that threshold being crossed all over the world, including here in Australia and New Zealand. Cities like Perth, for example, now effectively in Perth, surface water from reservoirs is not on the table as a water supply option, and the management of water in that city has had to move on to other sources and diversify supply and make do with different sources of water security.
Great. So that kind of leads nicely into the next section around the innovations that you are seeing, and I guess you've touched on that. Is there a specific project that you've worked on that a favourite of yours that really highlights the innovation that we're seeing or that you're seeing out there?
Probably not one specific project. Unfortunately, a lot of projects that we work on, I can't describe in detail who the client is or what we've done. But I think one area,
maybe not necessarily. What do you say? Is there something out there you go, you know what, I'd love it if we could do something like this here in Australia, because this just epitomizes what I see is what's required by the sector.
Thanks. So I think one perhaps type of water user that I haven't spoken about much yet is the large corporate water user. And so I think, there are some sectors of the economy that are particularly exposed to water-related risks and supply chain risks, and agriculture and mining here in Australia, for example, come to mind. And I think that we're really now crossing a threshold with private sector-led water risk management, water risk identification and management being more and more at the leading edge of what's possible. And so I think in Australia, we're doing a reasonable job among particularly some of our very large, ASX listed corporates around identifying those risks in their supply chains that are related to water and putting in place strategies to manage and mitigate those. But I think we probably still lag behind, the US and Europe to some extent in terms of leading the way, corporate-led initiatives for water risk management. And so I think to the extent that we can continue to grow the prominence of water outside of sustainability teams in some of these organizations and at the C-suite and board level, where the decisions I think really do need to be made, and that reflects the level of impact that some of these water risks can have on a business. In agribusiness, if you're a large winery, wine producer here in Australia, for example, your business is turning water into cash by producing wine in the middle, to put it very simply. And so, those businesses in their supply chain, where they might be drawing grapes from across many different vineyards across the country, I think increasingly some of those sorts of organizations really now see that they need to understand at a granular level where they're exposed to risk, and how to mitigate and manage that through the water market, through internal corporate initiatives, through reporting. And so, I think we're really sort of just on the sort of the start of a real upturn in corporate awareness of and action around water risk, which is pretty exciting.
Great. Thanks so much, Hugh. We'll loop back around. We've got some questions towards the end, but for now, I'd like to introduce Kerry Griffiths. Kerry's the IS Technical Director at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, or ISCA. ISCA is a member-based, not-for-profit peak body operating in Australia and New Zealand to enable sustainability outcomes in infrastructure. Kerry completed a PhD on how to enhance sustainability outcomes by using sustainability rating tools in infrastructure, and is well-versed in all things infrastructure sustainability. Kerry, maybe you could give us a little background in terms of your role within ISCA, and then step into what water innovation looks like in IS version 2.
Sure, great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everybody. Great to be joining you all today on an important day focusing on this topic. So as Richard said, I'm the Technical Director at ISCA, and have been in that role with the organisation for just under 12 months now. My role is to focus on the development of the scheme from a technical perspective, but also the continuous improvement of our scheme as it is used and applied kind of in the marketplace. Just for those, as a bit of kind of context, I guess, there are around about 165 projects currently that are applying the ISCA rating, and that would be a range of civil infrastructure projects, whether that's roads, metros, water infrastructure itself, other types of infrastructure, sports parks, or energy infrastructure in both Australia and New Zealand. The majority of projects currently in Australia, but a growing number now in New Zealand, with the Transport Agency, or Kotahi, having mandated the use of the tool on certain projects over a certain size. So For those who aren't familiar with the ISCA tool, it is a framework for rating sustainability performance on civil infrastructure. It focuses on beyond compliance, and from a water perspective, there are a number of areas in the tool that focus on water use, water quality across all of the projects that would use our tool. And then obviously for water infrastructure projects, there's a particular focus that they would have around driving sustainability outcomes. But Richard, will I move on to talking about our version 2 framework?
Yeah, I think if you can talk about that, but I guess in the context of what you see as water innovation.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yep. So version 2, just to again for people who are unfamiliar with the ISCA framework, we have a new version that has been piloted in the market and has been updated. That's kind of the major project that I've been working on over the last 12 months. So I'm intimately familiar with it. And from the perspective of how version 2 and the changes to our rating scheme focus on water or might drive innovation, there are a number of ways, and I'll just kind of outline them now. And again, if there are questions that people have, happy to pick those up a bit later. One of the interesting things with version 2 is that we, as well as our design and as-built rating, which is used on design and construction projects, we introduce a planning rating. And I guess that kind of goes along with the concept that I'm sure many of you will have experienced in your own work. The earlier you can start integrating sustainability outcomes into decision making and investment decisions, into supply chain decisions, then the more impact you can have over the longer term. And so the planning rating allows projects to think about some of those options assessments, that the options they're considering. And from a water perspective, that means that things that perhaps you may not be able to do once you're kind of into design and into construction can really be thought about a lot more in terms of the longer term outcomes of a piece of infrastructure, what you're aiming to achieve, and what the options are that you might assess in achieving that. And so having a planning rating allows across all decision making, but in the water area, clearly it can give consideration to what options you might look at, whether that's to do with water use, water quality, what are some of the alternatives that might mitigate adverse impacts, or might give greater opportunity for restoration or benefits, or reduced water use, water efficiency, etc. So that planning rating really has a big impact on the whole flow through over the life cycle of infrastructure. Also in version 2, there were a number of different areas that we've introduced that weren't in the original version. And resilience planning is one of those that I think from a water perspective also can have quite a significant impact. The resilient planning credit or category within the scheme did just used to focus on climate risk, but now it has a broader resilience focus, which looks at interdependencies and thinks about infrastructure as part of a network. So whether that's resilience planning for emergency or natural hazards, or whether it's for other power failures or whatever it is, or that you're looking at the interdependence between pieces of infrastructure, which rating tools often focus very much at the asset level. But our resilience planning credit gets projects and proponents to think about their piece of infrastructure as part of a wider system. So that can have a strong connection to water demand or water dependency, and also kind of emergency response. A couple of the other areas that we've introduced under version 2 that I think also, that whole kind of planning area, we've introduced a number of planning credits within different categories. So resource efficiency planning and resource use planning. We have credits that look at individual areas like materials use or waste management, But having this planning credit, we've had really great feedback from projects that this has kind of had them kind of raise their gaze a little, bring things up to a slightly higher level, and to think about resource use and resource demand, not just during that design and construction phase, but across the life cycle of a piece of infrastructure. And that applies obviously to water use, water demand, over that life cycle. And doing that kind of high level planning early, I think, again, drives different awareness and different decision making, hopefully. One of the areas that fits into that really strongly in version 2, we've also introduced economics, an economics category and theme, which we didn't have before in the earlier version of the framework. And that economics, one of the economics credits looks a lot at options assessment, and that options assessment framework can be applied. Options assessment focused on multi-criteria assessment and also whole of life costs. And we apply that framework across a number of the different areas within the ISCA rating tool. So if you look at it from a water perspective, if we're looking at alternative sources of water, how do we make the best decisions related to that? So having a multi-criteria assessment framework, as well as completing whole of life costing for both water efficiency initiatives, water sourcing initiatives, a number of, again, across the range of areas, carbon, etc. But in terms of water ecology, where we're looking at ecological improvements, how do we assess those? And we've tried to introduce a more structured process for doing that. And picking up on one of the areas that Hugh spoke to earlier, we've also, in the economic credits, started to look at the introducing the use of externalities and how do we quantify externalities or monetize those kind of in our process. One other tiny thing, and then I'll stop for Richard's reflections, is also under the economics credits, we have a theme around benefits identification and realisation. So that at the planning rating, we're thinking about the end outcome of infrastructure. Often rating tools like ours can focus on what's happening on the ground during design and construction, but we really want to push our focus over time more to what are the outcomes of that infrastructure, what are the benefits for society out of that infrastructure, how do we map those, how do we influence those, how do we track those, and how do we evaluate those at the end of the infrastructure implementation, is going to become more and more a significant part of our framework. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, thanks, Kerry. No, that's a great overview. So are there any examples that you can think of that, where you're seeing innovation? Are there any projects or initiatives out there you go, wow, I love how they've approached this, or they're really pushing the boundaries around water? Or
let me talk to a couple of examples. I really reached out to our project managers who are working much more closely on a day-to-day basis with our different infrastructure projects and proponents and delivery teams, and they've shared some which I'll share with you. But before I pick up on those, I will talk to one myself, that because I think it's a topic that is worth adding to the mix, around cultural values attached to water. And in the I'm based in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, but obviously also in the Australian context, the cultural values attached to water, particularly related to our Indigenous people, are very strong and often not always integrated into decision making. And in New Zealand, we have a project which is a metro project, where they have worked very strongly with Mana Whenua, which is an Indigenous peoples group, who are partners in the delivery of that project, and for whom water quality is a very significant area. And so having their input into the decisions that are made around the impact of the project on water quality is something that project has developed a framework around, has agreed some performance criteria with the Mana Whenua Forum, and continues to work with them so that any decisions that are being made around impacts on water and impacts to water quality or improvements to water quality are reviewed with that Indigenous Peoples Forum. And in the New Zealand context, that will certainly continue to be an ongoing strong theme and a growing theme of importance. So working out ways to do that better, and sharing stories about what people are learning on projects where they are starting to work more closely with Māori as a partner is a significant element to that delivery. And the work that was done with City Rail Link was recognised as an innovation under the ISCA scheme in those early stages. Let me just pick up on a couple of other examples. The Bohr project, which is a ring road project in Western Australia, have been using the version 2 planning framework. And in the work that they did, they partnered with a not-for-profit called Ozfish, who are dedicated to running programs to improve the health and diversity of rivers and the species within them. And by working with them, they have identified some works that this project can undertake around what they call re-snagging, which is taking large dead trees and putting them into waterways to help restore important habitats and support biodiversity. And through the work that Bohr did in those early planning phases, they've got an arrangement where they are going to be putting a number of trees into the waterways that have been cleared in that area for construction. So that's just an example of something that thinking more about that broader system, about potential to partner with others, things that you can do when you're changing the landscape that can be beneficial if you think a bit more holistically around and not just about the particular physical asset you're delivering, but about the system that you're operating in. So those are maybe a couple of examples, and I can pick up on others as we go.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kerry. I think there'll be a couple of questions coming through down the track as well. But now I'd like to introduce Sahar Farzadnia. Sahar, thanks for joining us. Sahar is the Standards Officer at GECA, or Good Environmental Choice Australia. Nice to see a couple of B Corps on this panel as well. So GECA is Australia's only not-for-profit multi-sector eco-labelling program and advisory organisation. Sahar has a PhD in environmental chemistry. I'm feeling very underqualified on this panel, thanks everyone, and several years of professional and research experience in the environmental sector. Sahar is driven to help the local environment and community go beyond regulation by ensuring standards are rigorous and set at best practice for each industry. Sahar, so maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your role within GECA, and then maybe how GECA are really pushing best practice water standards.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here in this webinar. So I work as a standard and technical officer at GECA. So I work on development and revisions of GECA standards. We are, as you explained, we are an eco-labeling program. So our standards are based on international standards of ISO 14024. And our standards are recognized by many green building programs and several procurement guidelines. We are the only member of Global Eco-Labeling Network in Australia. So we have 26 standards at GECA, so obviously in different product categories, which these standards cover different aspects of product life cycle. quality, fit for purpose, environmental, health, and social aspects. So there are criteria in each standard covering each of these areas. So when it comes to the water topic, GECA standards look at specifically at limitations on of water contamination, toxicity of aquatic environment, discharge to water, and also water consumption and use during the manufacture of products. So GECA has some strict requirements which are included in almost all our standard, but obviously depending on the product categories, those requirements can slightly vary. GECA standards and criteria are also aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. For instance, SDG 6, which is about water quality, clean water and sanitation, and also reducing pollution, protect and restore of water-related ecosystem, and also SDG 14, which is about conserving and sustainable use of ocean and marine resources and prevent and reduce marine pollution of all kinds, and also pollution coming from land-based activities. So it's very much about limiting and controlling of those materials and pollution and contaminants going through our water bodies and the ecosystem. So I just give you a quick summary of some examples, criteria in GECA standards. Almost in all GECA standards, we have a section for hazardous substances. So in that section, there are limitations on use of substances that are classified based on GHS classification of hazard of chemicals, substances that are classified as toxic or harmful to aquatic environment. So basically, this type of substances should not be added, or there are very strict limitations on the amount or quantity of added chemicals that carry such hazards. So that's pretty much a universal criterion. And also in our cleaning and personal care products, we limit the use of bioaccumulative substances. So in general, all surfactants and organic ingredients that are going to be used in the manufacture of cleaning and personal care products should be proven biodegradable by presenting certain testing. So the manufacturer should test these ingredients or chemicals and present the test reports to show that they are readily biodegradable and actually not bioaccumulative. So the problem with non-biodegradable or bioaccumulative substances is basically these chemicals are very persistent in the environment and they are stable and don't break over time. So what happens is this, because most of the time these materials has got very long change of hydrocarbons, so they are very hydrophobe, meaning that they have high affinity to absorb and sit on organic medium. So when they enter water bodies, so they can enter to the body of organism and build up in their body. So the chemicals over time build up in their body in food chain, for instance, with the small organism that is consumed by a fish. So in food chain, these chemicals increase over time. And obviously when human use, for instance, fish or seafood, they can cause some health problems. And that's why we have strict limitations. Also in cleaning and personal care products, we have limitation on using of phosphorus compounds, phosphate and phosphate derived ingredients, so which is related to eutrophication. As we know, the excess amount of phosphates and phosphate ingredients in water and in general nutrients can be very harmful for the environment. And this is actually in line with SDG 14 and target 40.1, which requires the prevent and significantly reduction of marine pollution of all kinds from land-based activities, and for instance, including debris and nutrient pollution. The next standards I'm going to talk about is our furniture, panel standards, and carpet standards. So in all these standards, we have criteria about the discharge to water. So the total discharge from water from the manufacture of components like latex, foam, shall be treated strictly, and there is a need for the total organic carbon or chemical oxygen demand to be monitored and decreased by 90% before this water discharge happens, prior to discharging and prior to the stage that it goes to the receiving environment.
So are there any examples that I guess you can think of in terms of, some of the products that are GECA labeled? Like, is there anything that stands out to you that you go, you know what, this is best practice, or this can transform the industry, that potentially people listening into the webinar may not be aware of at this point in time? So any standouts?
Yes, so I wanted to give you a very good example of GECA certified products. They called e-water. So e-water is actually a very successful example of using very simple process and simple ingredients to produce a product which is of very low environmental and health impact. So e-water is actually the product, but the company is e-water system. So they are Australian-owned biotech company. So they're using this environmentally friendly water electrolysis technology, which produces cleaning and sanitizing solution for use within a variety of application, cleaning operations, including food industry. So the solutions that is produced by this machine is actually uses an on-site generator of electrolyzed water, which through the process it produces two independent solutions that are very effective, non-toxic, and biodegradable. So there are these two streams of solutions coming out of the electrolyzed water. So basically what e-water does is they apply an electrical charge to a mixture of ordinary tap water and salt, which is sodium chloride, and then a dilute salt solution goes through this electrolyzer, and it segregates the ions form, which produces oppositely charged solution with quite different altered physical and chemical properties. So ultimately it produces hygienic solution that can replace many conventional chemical products. So they are also an organic certified item, which is naturally biodegradable and doesn't leave any chemical residue. And a key point here is they are an alternative to packaged chemical agents. So they significantly don't use much packaging. So it is estimated that they collectively have replaced around 143 million liters of chemicals and over 32 million plastic bottles, which is quite impressive. So they are actually certified under two GECA standards: cleaning products and standard and personal care products. So the stream one is e-water cleaner. So it is certified under GECA cleaning products standard. So it's a universal multi-purpose cleaner which can cut through dirt and germs and doesn't leave any residue, and it's ideal for apparently all type of surfaces, stainless steel, glass, floor, and can be used for cleaning of equipment, and is also a food safe solution. The stream two is e-water sanitizer or e-water disinfectant. under GECA personal care products standard. But obviously, because these two standards, GECA standards, have different scope, so they needed to go under different standards. So this one, obviously, a sanitizer and disinfectant, very on demand these days, as we know, and it's an effective quick contact antimicrobial solution. Commercial grade disinfectant, it is effective against COVID-19 and can be used for cleaning and sanitizing surfaces, even for can be used as hand sanitizer.
Fantastic, thanks, Sahar. That's great. And eWater are a finalist in this year's Banksias Award, so that's my little plug for the Banksias. As are Icon Water, I've put a little link in the
they're
chat.
also a B Corp registered company.
Also B Corp, fantastic, excellent. Look, mindful of time, and Hayley, I'll jump back into you if that's okay. There's a couple of questions that have popped up on the chat there. So
yeah, absolutely. So while we've got Sahar there, I might jump with her first. There's a quick question around, are nanoparticles considered to be persistent toxic substances, and does the problem of plastic come into it? I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
Sorry, what was the material?
Nanoparticles?
Yeah, nanoparticles, they are actually, because of their size, so they're obviously smaller than microplastics and microparticles. But the thing is, they can, absorb into the tissues. They also have the affinity to go into soil. And that's why, and they can be quite persistent and sometimes toxic. And that's why there are limitations in almost all the schemes about nanoparticles and nanomaterials in general.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've got another question for Kerry, if you want to pop back in. Does the planning rating include net environmental gain? It sounds like it would fit into the benefits realisation and other economic frameworks like the circular economy.
Yeah, so the planning rating, as with all the ratings, each of our credit areas have different performance levels. And the top performance level is always looking for restorative or net gain outcomes. So that applies across a range of areas. And yes, you're right that the benefits realisation aspect is trying to kind of drive towards that as well. And the circular economy stuff picks up in our resource category, but we are also aware that we've got more work to do in the circular economy area. We do have circular economy outcomes as part of some of the credits, but we're looking to do more work in that area as we go into kind of our next phase of development.
Excellent. Thanks, Kerry. Now, I have a quick question for each of the three panellists as well. I'm going to give you 1 minute each to come back to me. But what I want to know is, as we hear about a lot of these things that are long-term goals or big infrastructure projects, and some of it can feel really unattainable to people to help out. So what I want to hear from each of you is just one thing that someone can do today that would have a positive water benefit for the world. What could you do today? Sahar, I'm going to come to you.
I would say using like in everyday life, using products like consumer good products that are of low environmental and health impact, especially low environmental impact, because whatever we use during the day, for hygiene purposes, personal care products, they contain lots of different chemicals and ingredients, and it's important to make a right decision and continuously use the products that have very low impact on our environment, especially on our water resources.
Excellent. Thanks. Kerry, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I think that it sort of relates a bit to what Hugh said earlier. I think valuing water just like we value other resources. And that means that we think about it differently, we make careful choices, and we think about how we impact it and how we can also do things that will help restore. All of those things are available to us today, and it's just being more deliberate about our decisions in terms of how we interface with water.
Thank you, Kerry. And Hugh?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to perhaps too flippantly say pay your water bill, particularly if it's overdue. But maybe what I would go for is to have a conversation with your children or other young people that you know around. I think just bringing a bit more visibility to where our water comes from and what goes into providing the water services that we take for granted.
Yeah, that's a great one. I know I love having those conversations where my kids say, why is it raining? And I give them the full scientific explanation and then they regret asking, but at least they know where the rain comes from and why it rains and where it falls and how does water get to my tap, and not taking any of that for granted. So I think that's a great one. Thanks for pointing that out to everyone. I think that's definitely something that most of us can do. Even not just kids, I'm sure a few adults would benefit from that conversation as well, to be honest with you. Thank you so much for answering those, and thanks everybody for putting a few of those questions through. That hour has gone really quickly, but before we leave, I would like to thank our sponsors of Talent Nation, our moderator Richard today. So if everyone can use your emoticons to clap or turn your video back on and clap, that'd be awesome. All of our presenters, so Sahar, Kerry and Hugh, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and wisdom with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees who attended live. Hopefully you were sitting there eating lunch and drinking some water while we were going through everything today. So thanks very much for joining us. From an admin perspective, the video recording of this will be available on the Supply Chain School website. You'll get an email from us letting us know where it's at. And don't forget, our next webinar is happening on the 21st of April, which will coincide with World Creativity and Innovation Day. So we're tapping into a few really creative and innovative things there. And again, joining us will be the lovely guys from Talent Nation. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Richard, for moderating, and hopefully we'll catch you all again soon.